The morning sky over Earth changed forever when the ships arrived. Captain Jake Morrison was drinking his coffee on the Luna Defense Station when the alarm started screaming, and he dropped his cup as he ran to the command center where Lieutenant Kate Williams was staring at her screens with wide eyes. "Sir, we have contacts coming out of hyperspace," she said, and her voice was shaking. Jake looked at the main display and felt his blood turn cold because 12 massive ships were floating in. Space above Earth, and they were bigger than anything humans had ever built, and they looked like they were made of crystal that caught the light and threw it back in colors that hurt to look at. "Get me Admiral Brooks on Earth Command," Jake said, and he was trying to keep his voice steady, but his hands were shaking as he reached for the communication controls. The response came back in seconds, and Admiral Brooks sounded scared, which was something Jake had never heard before. "All stations. This is Earth Command, we have a situation," the Admiral said, and his voice was crackling through the speakers. "Unknown vessels have appeared in our space and they are not responding to our signals." Jake watched the crystal ships hang in space like giant diamonds, and they were so beautiful and so wrong at the same time, and he knew that everything was about to change. Then the message came, and it was broadcast on every frequency at once, and the voice that spoke was like music made of ice. "Humans of Earth," the voice said, and each word seemed to cut through the air. "I am Overlord Kethavar of the Zalathi Empire, and you will submit to our rule, or you will be destroyed." Jake felt the bottom drop out of his world as he listened to the alien speak, and the words were so simple and so terrible that he almost could not believe them. "We have conquered 47 star systems," Kethavar continued, "and you are now the 48th, and you will serve us as all others have served us, or you will cease to exist." Kate looked at Jake with fear in her eyes, and she whispered, "What do we do, sir?" Before Jake could answer, the crystal ships began to move, and they moved like they were swimming through space instead of flying, and it was the most graceful and terrifying thing he had ever seen. The first human ship to approach was the destroyer Falcon, and Jake watched on his screens as it fired everything it had at the nearest crystal ship, and the weapons struck the alien vessel and just disappeared like they had never existed at all. The crystal ship did not even slow down, and it pointed something at the Falcon that looked like a flower made of light. And suddenly the human destroyer just stopped moving and all its lights went out. "The Falcon is dead in space," Kate reported, and her voice was barely a whisper. "No life signs, no power, no nothing. More human ships tried to fight, and the same thing happened to all of them, and within an hour the entire Earth defense fleet was floating helpless in space like broken toys." Jake watched the crystal ships descend toward Earth, and he knew that there was nothing anyone could do to stop them, and he felt sick and angry and helpless all at the same time. The news reports started, coming in from Earth, and they were all the same, and they were all terrible. New York was under alien control, and London was under alien control, and Tokyo and Moscow and every major city on the planet was being occupied by creatures that looked like they were made of living crystal. Dr. Lisa Parker was on Mars when the invasion began, and she was studying alien signals that the research station had been picking up for months, and now she understood what they meant. The Zalathi had been watching Earth and planning and waiting, and humans had never known they were there. Lisa looked at the data streaming across her screens, and she saw something that made her heart race with hope instead of fear. The alien communications showed patterns that suggested the Zalathi were afraid of something about humans, and she could not understand what it was yet, but she knew it was important on Earth. The crystal beings were 12 feet tall, and they moved like dancers, and their skin reflected light in ways that made them hard to look at directly. They set up control centers in every major city, and they began scanning humans with devices that hummed with power, and anyone who resisted was put into cages, made of energy that glowed blue and cold. Lieutenant Commander Nick Sullivan was in the outer colonies when Earth fell, and he gathered every ship he could find and refused to surrender even though everyone told him it was hopeless. "They want us to give up," he told his crew over the radio. "But that is not what humans do, and we are going to fight until we cannot fight anymore." Jake Morrison evacuated the Luna station before the crystal ships could capture it, and he took his people to hidden bases on Earth, where they began planning resistance. The world had changed in a single day, and the crystal aliens ruled from their towers of light, while humans hid in the shadows and tried to figure out how to fight beings who seemed to have power beyond understanding. But Jake knew that humans had survived ice ages and plagues and wars, and they would survive this too, because giving up was not something humans knew how to do, and freedom was worth any price they had to pay. 3 months had passed since the crystal ships arrived, and the world looked different now. Jake Morrison crouched in a cave deep in the Rocky Mountains and listened to the reports coming in from resistance cells around the globe, and none of the news was good. The Zalathi had built control towers in every major city, and these towers hummed with energy that made humans feel sick when they got too close, and anyone who tried to attack them just disappeared. Kate Williams sat next to Jake and worked on a radio that she had built from spare parts, and her fingers moved quickly over the controls as she tried to reach other resistance groups. "Chicago cell is gone," she whispered, and her voice was tight with anger. "Tony Rodriguez got out, but most of his people did not." Jake nodded and felt the familiar weight of guilt settle on his shoulders, because every day more good people died, and he could not save them. The Zalathi were not just occupying Earth, and they were changing it and studying every human they could capture, and the ones who fought back too hard were taken away and never seen again. Dr. Lisa Parker worked in the underground labs on Mars, where the research station had been hidden since the invasion began, and she was making progress on understanding the alien signals. The patterns she found in Zalathi communications were strange, and they showed something that gave her hope. "They are afraid of us," she told her assistant Ben Clark as they looked at the data. "On their screens, I do not know why yet, but they scan every human, like they are looking for something dangerous." Ben shook his head and pointed at the reports from Earth that showed cities burning and humans being herded into processing centers. "If they are afraid, then why are they winning?" he asked. Lisa did not have an answer yet, but she knew she was close to finding one back on Earth. Tony Rodriguez had escaped from Chicago when the Zalathi destroyed his hideout, and now he was moving through the ruins with 5 other survivors. Tony had been a mechanic before the invasion, and he knew how machines worked, and he had noticed something important about Zalathi technology. "Their stuff does not like electricity," he told his team as they crept through the broken streets. "I saw one of their flying machines crash when lightning hit it." The group carried crude devices that Tony had built from car parts and scrap metal, and these devices could create electromagnetic pulses that sometimes disrupted alien equipment. It was not much, but it was something, and Tony believed that something was better than nothing. Amy Chen flew supply runs between resistance cells in a small ship that she had stolen from a Zalathi patrol, and she had painted it to look like Space Junkie had been a pilot for NASA before the invasion, and she knew every hiding place in the asteroid belt and every route that ships could take without being detected. She carried messages and supplies, and sometimes she carried people who needed to escape from one cell to another, and every trip was dangerous, but she never stopped flying. The Zalathi patrols were getting smarter, and they were learning human tactics, but Amy was always one step ahead because she flew like no one else could fly on Europa. Nick Sullivan had gathered 200 ships and crews who refused to give up, and they struck at Zalathi supply lines whenever they could. The attacks did little damage, but they showed the aliens that humans would never stop fighting, and they gave hope to people who thought all hope was lost. Nick stood on the bridge of his flagship and looked at the reports from his scouts, and he smiled grimly. "They control the major systems, but they cannot be everywhere," He told his captains, "And that means there are places where we can hurt them." The resistance was growing, and people who had given up were starting to fight again because word was spreading that the aliens could be hurt. Jake Morrison moved his base, camped deeper into the mountains, and set up training centers where former soldiers taught civilians how to fight. The new recruits were teachers and farmers and shop owners who had lost everything when the crystal ships came, and they wanted revenge. "We cannot beat them with guns," Jake told the trainees, "but we can make them pay for every inch of ground they take." The Zalathi were building massive facilities where they processed captured humans and tried to understand how human minds worked, and those who came out were changed and broken. But some humans escaped from these facilities, and they brought information about alien weaknesses and plans. Lisa Parker received a message from one of these escapees, and the information made her hands shake with excitement. The escapee had seen inside a Zalathi processing center and had learned that the aliens were specifically looking for humans who could think in ways that the Zalathi could not predict. "They call it chaos thinking," the message said, "and they are terrified of it." Lisa realized that this was what she had been seeing in the alien communications, and she began working on ways to amplify this chaos thinking in human minds. Meanwhile, Tony Rodriguez had reached the ruins of Detroit, where other mechanics and engineers were building better weapons from salvaged alien technology. They had learned to combine human creativity with Zalathi materials, and the results were crude but effective. The resistance was learning and growing and adapting, while the Zalathi grew more frustrated because humans did not behave like other species they had conquered. Other conquered species had fought with logic and strategy that the aliens could understand and counter, but humans fought with emotion and stubbornness and random inspiration that made no sense. Jake Morrison sat in his cave and listened to reports of small victories, and he felt something he had not felt since the invasion began hope. 6 months after the crystal ships came, Dr. Lisa Parker made a discovery that changed everything. She was deep underground on Mars in the research facility that the Zalathi had not found yet when her scanners detected something strange beneath the red soil. "Ben, get over here." She called to her assistant, and her voice was shaking with excitement. "We are not the first ones to live on Mars. The excavation took weeks because they had to work in secret and use equipment that would not attract Zalathi attention. But what they found was worth the risk. Buried beneath layers of ancient rock was a structure that had been built millions of years ago by beings who called themselves the Vanguard. The ruins were filled with technology that still worked, and records that told a story that made Lisa want to cry with relief. The Vanguard had fought the Zalathi Empire 3 million years ago, and they had won. Lisa read the alien records with growing amazement, because the Vanguard had discovered the same weakness in Zalathi, thinking that she was beginning to understand. The crystal beings were purely logical, and they could predict and counter any strategy that followed patterns, but they could not handle true randomness. "Ben, look at this," Lisa said as she translated another section of the Vanguard records. "They built weapons that amplified chaotic thinking in organic minds. The weapons were still there in the ruins, and some of them still worked, and Lisa began to understand how humans could fight back on Earth." Jake Morrison received a coded message from Mars that made him gather his top lieutenants for an emergency meeting. Kate Williams sat next to him in the cave that served as their command center and read the message. 3 times before she spoke, "Lisa says she found weapons that can hurt them," Kate said, and her voice was barely a whisper. "Real weapons, not just tricks and disruptions." Jake felt his heart racing because for 6 months they had been fighting with barely enough firepower to annoy the Zalathi, and now there might be a real chance. Tony Rodriguez had made his way to the Rocky Mountains after escaping from Detroit, and he brought news that made Jake even more hopeful. "They are having problems in the cities," Tony said as he showed Jake photographs he had taken of Zalathi installations. "Their equipment keeps breaking down, and they cannot figure out why." The photographs showed crystal towers that flickered and went dark, and Zalathi Patrol, craft that crashed for no apparent reason. It is happening everywhere. Humans work on their stuff. Tony continued. Like our touch is poison to their machines. Amy Chen landed her stolen ship near Jake's base and brought supplies and people from resistance cells across the solar system. She also brought news from Nick Sullivan and his fleet in the outer system. Nick says the aliens are pulling ships back from the frontier. Amy reported, they are concentrating their forces around Earth and Mars like they are getting scared. Jake nodded because that matched what he was seeing from his mountain hideout. The Zalathi patrols were more frequent, but they seemed nervous and they avoided areas where humans had been active. Dr. Lisa Parker worked day and night to understand the Vanguard technology and how it could be adapted for human use. The ancient weapons were designed to amplify the chaotic patterns in organic minds and turn those patterns into energy that could disrupt Zalathi neural networks. It is like using our unpredictability as a weapon, she explained to Ben as they tested a small device on Martian soil. When Lisa activated the device, it sent out waves that made nearby rocks vibrate in random patterns, and the effect was hypnotic and terrifying. If we can build bigger versions of these and get them to Earth, then we can start fighting back for real, Lisa said. Meanwhile, the Zalathi were having their own problems, because Overlord Kethvar was receiving reports that confused and angered him. His commanders told him that human resistance was increasing instead of decreasing, and that equipment failures were becoming common in areas with high human populations. How can primitive beings affect our technology? Kethvar demanded, but his scientists could not give him an answer. The Zalathi had conquered dozens of species, and all of them had followed predictable patterns of submission or organized resistance. Humans were different, and they did things that made no logical sense, and somehow those illogical actions were effective. Kethvar ordered more troops to Earth and more processing facilities to study human minds, but the problems only got worse. Jake Morrison began planning Operation Wildcard based on the information from Mars and the weapons technology that Lisa was sending to Earth. The plan was simple and insane, and it involved coordinated attacks on every major Zalathi installation on the planet at exactly the same time. They expect us to be logical, Jake told his team, so we are going to be as illogical as possible. The attacks would use no pattern that the Zalathi could predict, and each cell would make decisions on the spot based on whatever seemed like the worst possible tactical choice. Tony Rodriguez laughed when he heard the plan because it was so crazy that it might actually work. "You want us to do everything wrong on purpose?" he said. "Exactly," Jake replied. "And while they are trying to figure out what we are doing, we hit them with Lisa's chaos weapons." Kate Williams coordinated communications between resistance cells around the world, and the messages she sent were deliberately confusing and contradictory. Nick Sullivan brought his fleet in from the outer system and prepared to attack the Zalathi ships in orbit, but his battle plan changed every few minutes based on coin flips and random number generators. Amy Chen practiced flying patterns that violated every rule of space combat and made no sense from any tactical perspective. Dr. Lisa Parker finished building the first batch of chaos weapons and sent them to Earth, hidden inside supply drops that looked like random space debris, as the weapons reached Earth and were distributed to resistance cells. Jake Morrison felt something he had not felt since the invasion began. He felt like humans were about to remind the universe why they had survived every challenge their planet had thrown at them. 1 year after the crystal ships arrived, the resistance struck back with weapons that turned human chaos into power. Jake Morrison stood on a mountain peak and watched explosions bloom across the valley below as Operation Wildcard began in 4. The first time since the invasion, he smiled. The chaos weapons that Dr. Lisa Parker had built from Vanguard technology were working better than anyone had dared to hope. Each device looked like a simple metal box, but when activated by human thoughts, that followed no pattern. The weapons sent out waves that made Zalathi equipment fail in spectacular ways. Kate Williams coordinated the attacks from her radio station hidden deep in the caves, and she sent messages that sounded like random noise, but told each resistance cell exactly when to strike. "Chicago cell reports success," she called out to Jake. "The control tower is down, and Tony says the aliens are running around like they lost their minds." Jake nodded and watched through his binoculars as more Zalathi installations went dark across the continent. The attacks were happening everywhere at once, and none of them followed any tactical doctrine that made sense, which was exactly the point in Detroit. Tony Rodriguez led a team of mechanics and engineers against a Zalathi processing facility, and they used chaos weapons combined with electromagnetic pulse devices. "Hit them now!" Tony shouted as his team activated their weapons, and the effect was immediate and devastating. The crystal. Beings inside the facility suddenly stopped moving, and their skin lost its beautiful glow and became dull and gray, like they were sick. Tony and his team rushed inside and found hundreds of humans in energy cages. And when the chaos weapons disrupted the Zalathi systems, the cages opened. "Get everyone out," Tony ordered, as freed prisoners stumbled into the daylight for the first time in months. Many of the freed humans had been changed by Zalathi experiments, but they were alive, and they were angry. And they wanted to fight. Dr. Lisa Parker watched the battle reports from her laboratory on Mars and felt a mixture of pride and terror at what her weapons could do. The chaos devices worked by amplifying the random patterns in human consciousness and turning those patterns into energy that Zalathi minds could not process. "It is like screaming gibberish at someone who only understands mathematics," she explained to Ben Clark as they monitored the global attacks. But Lisa knew that the weapons had limitations, and they could only be used by humans whose minds were truly chaotic and unpredictable. Some humans had become too ordered and logical through education or military training, and they could not activate the chaos weapons effectively. "We need people who think sideways," Lisa said. "Artists and dreamers, and people who never learned to color inside the lines." Meanwhile, Amy Chen was flying the most important mission of her life as she piloted the first spacecraft enhanced with Vanguard technology. The ship she called Liberty's Edge could phase through Zalathi shields by following flight patterns that defied physics and logic. Amy flew by instinct rather than instruments, and she made decisions based on feelings rather than calculations. And somehow this allowed her to do things that should have been impossible. She slipped through the Zalathi blockade around Earth like she was invisible and delivered crucial supplies to resistance cells that had been cut off for months. "I do not understand how this works," Amy told herself as her ship passed through solid crystal barriers. "But I do not need to understand it." The Zalathi Empire was experiencing something it had never faced before because humans were the first species that fought with pure chaos instead of organized strategy. Overlord Kethvar stood in his command center aboard his flagship and stared at reports that made no sense to his logical mind. "How can random attacks be so effective?" he demanded of his advisors. But they had no answers. The crystal beings had spent millions of years perfecting their ability to predict and counter enemy tactics, but humans did not use tactics that could be predicted. Nick Sullivan brought his fleet out of hiding and attacked the Zalathi ships in orbit using battle plans that he changed constantly based on dice rolls and coin flips. The Zalathi responded to each human move with logical counter-moves, but by the time they acted, the humans had already changed to completely different strategies. "They are fighting like they are insane," one Zalathi commander reported to Kethvar. "Their ships move in patterns that violate all principles of space combat, but the insane patterns were working because 3 Zalathi dreadnoughts had been destroyed and their debris was falling toward Earth in burning streaks." Jake Morrison transformed from guerrilla leader to general as more humans joined the resistance every day. His mountain stronghold became a training center where former soldiers taught civilians how to fight. But the most important lessons were about forgetting everything they knew about warfare. Stop thinking like soldiers. Jake told his trainees, start thinking like humans. The training exercises involved art, therapy and improvisation games and meditation techniques designed to break down logical thought patterns. Students who excelled were those who could make decisions without reasoning and who could act on pure impulse without second-guessing themselves. Parker made another breakthrough when she discovered that humans who had been exposed to Zalathi processing became even better at activating chaos weapons. The alien experiments damaged their logical thinking, she explained in a report to Jake. But that damage makes them more chaotic and more dangerous to the Zalathi. This meant that every human the aliens had captured and experimented on could become a weapon against them. Tony Rodriguez organized teams of freed prisoners and taught them to use their enhanced chaotic abilities to sabotage Zalathi equipment just by touching it. Your minds are broken in exactly the right way, he told them, and that makes you our secret weapon. The Resistance began liberating processing facilities across the globe, and each rescue mission added more Chaos Warriors to their ranks. The Zalathi found themselves facing an enemy that grew stronger with every victory and learned from every defeat in ways that made no logical sense. Kethvar ordered reinforcements from the home worlds, but other Zalathi commanders were beginning to question the cost of conquering one primitive planet. We have lost more ships fighting humans than we lost conquering the previous 10 worlds combined. One admiral reported. For the first time in their history, the Zalathi Empire was facing the possibility that they might not win a war. And Jake Morrison stood on his mountain and watched the lights of burning Zalathi installations across the horizon, and he knew that freedom was finally within reach. 18 months after the invasion began, the human resistance became a revolution that spread beyond Earth to 50 worlds across the galaxy. Jake Morrison received messages from alien species that had been slaves of the Zalathi Empire for centuries, and they all said the same thing. The news of human victories had reached their worlds, and they were starting to fight back too. They want to know how we do it, Kate Williams told Jake as she decoded another message from the Rigel system. They say their species tried logical resistance for decades and failed. Jake laughed because the answer was so simple that it was hard to explain. Humans fought with their hearts instead of their heads, and they made decisions based on hope instead of calculations. Dr. Lisa Parker had perfected the chaos weapons, and now they could be built from common materials found on any industrial world. She sent the blueprints to resistance cells throughout the galaxy, along with instructions written in simple language that any species could understand. Think of the most illogical thing you can do, and then do it. The instructions read, trust your instincts even when they make no sense. The weapons worked for other species too, but not as well as they worked for humans, because humans were naturally better at chaos thinking. Tony Rodriguez led the liberation of Chicago using a combination of chaos weapons and alien slaves who had joined the human resistance. The battle was fierce, but short, because the Zalathi defenders could not coordinate their response when their equipment kept failing. Welcome to Free Chicago, Tony announced, as the last Zalathi troops retreated to their ships. Population stubborn humans and friends, the liberated city became a symbol of hope. For enslaved species across the galaxy, and alien refugees began arriving to learn human fighting techniques. Amy Chen commanded a fleet of ships enhanced with Vanguard technology and crewed by mixed human and alien teams. The pilots learned to fly, using human chaos methods, and the results were devastating to Zalathi forces who expected logical attack patterns. Stop thinking and start feeling. Amy taught her alien students, let the ship tell you where to go instead of telling the ship what to do. Some species adapted to chaos, fighting better than others, but all of them improved when they learned to embrace randomness and unpredictability. Nick Sullivan coordinated space battles that involved hundreds of ships from dozens of different species, and each battle was won through pure improvisation. The combined fleet used no standard formations or communication protocols because those could be predicted and countered by Zalathi computers. Instead, each ship captain made moment-by-moment decisions based on intuition, and the overall effect was beautiful chaos that no logical mind could comprehend. Lisa Parker established research stations on liberated worlds where scientists from many species worked together to improve chaos weapons. Breakthrough came when they discovered how to network multiple chaos devices together to create planet-wide disruption fields. If we can build enough of these and coordinate them properly, we can shut down every Zalathi installation in an entire star system. Lisa explained. The project required materials and labor from dozens of worlds, but the liberated species worked with desperate enthusiasm. Because they could finally see victory, Jake Morrison was no longer just a resistance leader, but had become the unofficial coordinator of the Galactic Revolution. He established a council that included representatives from every liberated world and species, but the council made decisions using chaos methods rather than parliamentary procedure. We vote by coin flip when we cannot agree, Jake told new council members. And we change our minds whenever we feel like it. The system should not have worked, but it was more effective than any government the galaxy had ever seen because it could not be infiltrated or predicted. The Zalathi Empire began to collapse from within as their ordered society struggled to comprehend what was happening. Overlord Kethvar called emergency sessions with his high command, but their meetings achieved nothing. Because they could not understand their enemy. How do we fight beings who fight without strategy? One commander asked. How do we predict the actions of minds that do not think logically? Asked another. Kethvar had no answers because the Zalathi had never encountered chaos as a weapon before. The crystal beings began experiencing something they had never known, which was doubt and uncertainty and fear. Their society was based on perfect order and logical thinking, but now they faced an enemy. That proved logic was not always superior. Some Zalathi began to question their empire and their methods, and a few even defected to join the human-led revolution. We have been wrong about the nature of intelligence, one defector told Jake Morrison. We thought order was strength, but chaos can be stronger. The revolution gained momentum as more worlds fell to combined human and alien forces using chaos weapons and unpredictable tactics. Each victory brought more species into the rebellion, and each new species added their own forms of chaos to the mix. The galaxy had been ruled by logic and order for millions of years, but now it was learning the power of beautiful randomness. Tony Rodriguez organized sabotage missions that targeted Zalathi, supply lines and communication networks across multiple star systems. The saboteurs used no coordination beyond general timing, and they struck wherever they found opportunity rather than following predetermined plans. The effect was devastating because the Zalathi could not protect everything everywhere, and they never knew where the next attack would come. Amy Chen led deep strike missions into the heart of Zalathi space, using ships that phased through their defenses like ghosts. Her pilots reported that Zalathi worlds were in chaos as their populations struggled to understand how their perfect empire could be failing. They are arguing among themselves, one pilot reported. Some want to negotiate, and others want to fight harder, but they cannot agree on anything. Lisa Parker received intelligence that the Zalathi High Command was fracturing as different factions blamed each other for the military disasters. Their logic is turning against them, she told Jake. They cannot accept that they might be wrong, so they are looking for logical explanations that do not exist. Jake Morrison stood in the command center of the liberated station orbiting Mars and looked at displays showing the spread of revolution across the Galaxy 50 star. Systems were now free, and more were joining the rebellion every day as the news spread that the Zalathi could be defeated. The Crystal Empire that had seemed invincible was crumbling because it had finally met an enemy that refused to fight by. any rules, and Jake knew that the final battle was coming soon. 2 years after the crystal ships first appeared, the final battle began in the skies above Earth and in the ruins of what had once been New York. Jake Morrison led a combined army of humans and liberated aliens through the twisted streets toward the massive Zalathi command complex that rose like a crystal mountain from the harbor. The building changed shape as they approached because it was alive in ways that human minds could barely understand. But Jake was no longer intimidated by alien technology. "Remember what we learned," he told his troops over the radio. "Think with your hearts and fight with your souls, and do not let their logic confuse you." The chaos weapons that Dr. Lisa Parker had built were strapped to the backs of soldiers from a dozen different species, and each weapon hummed with the power of pure randomness. Behind them, the sky burned with the light of space battles as Nick Sullivan's fleet fought the last Zalathi armada above the planet Amy Chen piloted Liberties. Edged through the orbital combat zone, and her ship moved like a living thing as she followed flight patterns that changed with her emotions. "This is for everyone who died," she whispered as she armed the massive chaos bomb that Lisa Parker had built in the laboratories on Mars. The bomb was designed to release 2 years' worth of stored chaotic energy in a single pulse that would reach every Zalathi mind in the solar system. But first, Jake and his army had to reach the command complex and plant smaller chaos devices throughout the building. The crystal walls of the Zalathi fortress shifted and moved to block their path, but Tony Rodriguez had taught his demolition teams to think like the building instead of fighting against it. The walls. "Wanna move, so let them move," Tony shouted, as his team placed charges that would detonate in random patterns. Each explosion created new openings that the building could not predict or counter because the humans were working with chaos instead of against Order Lisa. Parker watched the battle from her command post on Mars and coordinated the timing of chaos weapon deployments across the solar system. Her screens showed Zalathi installations going dark as the chaotic energy disrupted their neural networks and made their technology fail. "Now, Amy," Lisa said into her communicator, "hit them with everything we have." Amy Chen dove Liberty's edge toward the Zalathi flagship where Overlord Kethvar commanded the last organized resistance. Her ship phased through the crystal hull like it was made of mist, and she found herself in a vast chamber filled with geometric patterns that hurt to look at. Kethvar stood at the center of the chamber, and for the first time, Amy saw fear in the crystalline features of a Zalathi leader. "You have destroyed everything we built," Kethvar said, and his voice carried harmonics that made Amy's bones ache. "We built it wrong," Amy replied, as she activated the chaos bomb. The explosion was not visible, but every living mind in the solar system felt it as a wave of pure randomness that washed through space. Zalathi, across the fleet, suddenly experienced something they had never known before, which was the absence of logic and the presence of doubt, their perfect order collapsed in seconds as their minds were forced to confront thoughts that followed no pattern and made no sense. Kethvar screamed as the chaos energy tore through his consciousness and showed him that his empire was built on the false belief that logic was the only form of intelligence. On Earth, Jake Morrison's army stormed through the command complex as the building's defenses failed and the crystal walls began to crack. The chaos weapons had done their work, and the Zalathi defenders moved like sleepwalkers as their ordered minds struggled to process random thoughts. "Secure the communication center," Jake ordered as his troops spread through the complex. Kate Williams worked frantically to broadcast a message to every Zalathi world using their own communication network. "The war is over," she transmitted in the crystal being's musical language. "Your empire has fallen, and your people can choose freedom or slavery, but they can no longer choose conquest." The message reached Zalathi worlds across the galaxy, and on each world, the local populations faced the same choice: Some chose to fight, but they fought without coordination or strategy because their command structure had collapsed. Others chose to surrender and asked for terms that would allow them to rebuild their society without the rigid order that had defined them for millions of years. Still others chose exile and fled to the unexplored regions of space, where they could try to maintain their old ways. Tony Rodriguez stood in the ruins of the Zalathi Command Center and looked at crystal technology that no longer worked because the minds that had created it were broken. "What do we do with all this?" he asked. Jake Morrison looked around at the alien, machines, and the crystal beings who sat motionless on the floor, and he felt something that surprised him. He felt pity for his former enemies because they had lost more than a war, and they had lost their understanding of reality itself. "We help them," Jake said finally. "We teach them that chaos is not evil, and that freedom is worth the confusion it brings." Dr. Lisa Parker arrived from Mars with teams of scientists who began studying ways to heal the damaged Zalathi minds without destroying their essential nature. "They can learn to think chaotically," she explained, "but it will take time and patience, and they will need teachers who understand both order and chaos." Amy Chen landed Liberty's Edge in the harbor and walked through the liberated city, where humans and aliens worked together to rebuild what the war had destroyed. The galaxy was free, but freedom was just the beginning, because now billions of beings had to learn how to live without masters. Nick Sullivan's fleet patrolled the space lanes and ensured that trade resumed between the liberated worlds, but the ships flew in patterns that no enemy could predict. The revolution had succeeded, but the real work was just starting, because building a free society was harder than destroying a tyrannical empire. Jake Morrison stood on the observation deck of the restored Luna station and looked out at Earth, where the lights of cities once again shone bright in the darkness. Kate Williams stood beside him and watched ships from dozens of worlds arrive in Earth orbit, carrying refugees and diplomats and traders. "Do you think we did the right thing?" she asked. Jake nodded, because he knew that freedom was always the right choice, even when it led to confusion and uncertainty. The galaxy would never be the same, because humans had proven that chaos guided by hope was stronger than order, enforced by fear. And in the years that followed, human teachers would travel to 1,000 worlds and teach 1 billion beings the most important lesson of all: freedom is not given, and it is not taken, and it must be chosen again every day by every person who values the right to make their own mistakes and follow their own dreams. The Zalathi Empire was gone, but in its place arose something better, which was a galaxy where every being could choose their own path through the beautiful chaos of existence.